So, just a little bit about the problem of evil today, especially evil in light of monotheism, the belief in only one God. It raises all sorts of questions and problems about what do you do with evil and bad things in the world. And so, Job is a book that deals with the very questions many persons of faith do as well today, or not even persons of faith. Job is part of the corpus of wisdom literature in the Bible. So we have three books of this genre: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. This is not the book of Job, although I'm sure you would all use that manual. This is the book of Job, and it does deal with existential, philosophical, and wisdom questions. So the wisdom genre in the Bible, the literature in the Bible, is marked by a certain number of characteristics. One of which is that the word for wisdom is chokhmah, which is the feminine word in Hebrew. So wisdom is also often feminized or even personified as a woman. So you'll see that in the book of Proverbs. It's a woman, it's even a wife of God. It's sort of an interesting personification. And then it is these books are ahistorical. In other words, they don't situate themselves within a certain time or place, and you could think about why that might be. Obviously, this is to be universally applicable, so they don't put these stories within a very identifiable time and place. And then these books deal with the behavior of individuals one-on-one, so these horizontal relationships. How do you treat your mother, your neighbor, your brother, instead of how should Israel understand their relationship with God as a collective whole. So these are about individual behaviors and moral and social order. How do you keep social order within the community? Okay, so the book of Job, I did not have you read the whole book, but there is an interesting progression in the entire book. So I encourage you to read the whole thing if someday you get a chance, and think about the beginning and the ending, which is prose. And it was probably added later as sort of a prose prologue and sort of ending that was added to a collection of poems in the middle. This has movement. We have chapters 1 and 2, which present Job as this innocent, righteous human who is just an upstanding individual and ends up losing everything: property, children, family, health. Then by Job chapter 3, we see this lament about why was I even born? This is when bad things happen to good people. What do you do? How do you make sense of that? And the whole book is written to attempt to make sense of it, but you have to read it in context. So people could pull things, like I talk about cherry picking. You could cherry pick verses out of here, but you have to understand it's an entire movement and a point. You have to read it to the end. So we have 4 through 28, all of these chapters of debate. They're poems where his friends come and they debate with him, and they essentially represent we call standard biblical theology, or even standard Jewish theology, which is if you are righteous, you will be blessed, and if you sin, you will be cursed. So they debate that, basically that formula, because they say to him, well, you must have done something wrong. Somewhere, even if you didn't know about it, you must have sinned, because God would never do this to you if you hadn't. And so they represent the standard theology, and Job argues his innocence until the very end. So this represents sort of a problematic view of the rest of the Bible. It even questions Deuteronomy and Exodus and Leviticus. It even questions the law that's presented elsewhere in the Bible and says, well, I don't know about that. Is that true? Like if you just do all these things and you get these blessings, and if you screw up, you get curses. What happens if bad things happen to good people? And so this debate goes on until we get to Job 38, one of the most famous chapters in the entire Bible. Go back and read it now, or reread it if you haven't. So out of the whirlwind, all of these debates, what happened, why are these things happening to me? God answers from the whirlwind. And what is God's answer? pretty much a non-answer. Was kind of like, where were you when I created the world? And who are you to be talking and asking these questions? Read the chapter. It's quite a bit of a slap in the face and a reminder to Job and his friends that they cannot know and they do not know. So it's not an answer to the debate. It's actually a reminder of the overwhelming power of God and that they don't understand anything. Kind of maybe unsatisfying if you were looking for some answers. And then Job responds with faith, as he's had throughout the entire book, which is sort of what he represents, is faith throughout all of the trauma and the suffering and the pain. His friends kind of go away going, yeah, maybe I was not right, and his fortunes were restored. Now think about the entire movement of the book. As a reader, you yourself go on a journey. And that journey is from the beginning, especially in the first few chapters. You are omniscient, which means you know all, even what's going on in the heavens. Some of you have written about how troubled you were that God was making up ways with Satan, about how faithful Job would be. And it seems a little problematic or troubling to some of you. But think about the fact that you as a reader or listener have omniscience. You know everything that's going on behind door number 2. And so you sort of think about Job as this poor character who just doesn't understand why all this is really happening. Poor Job, he just doesn't know. And then you go through the entire book, and then what happens by chapter 38? You realize that you're no wiser than Job himself. You really know nothing more about what's going on in the heavens or why bad things happen to good people. So it's a bit of what we call dramatic irony throughout the whole book. You are sort of led to believe you know what's going on, and then by the end you realize you don't. And that's how the book ends, is kind of maybe unsatisfying for some, but it rests on complete faith in God because you can't figure it out with your brain. So the dramatic irony is that you're no wiser than Job at the end. So the main thing to take away from this is the question of theodicy, not Homer's Odyssey, the Odyssey, but theodicy, which is the question of God's righteousness. If you know the Latin, theo and dici is the righteousness of God. But the word means, how do you reconcile a belief in God and goodness with evil? So theodicy is making sense of a good power in the universe and an evil power in the universe. How do they exist together? What happens? How do you explain when bad things happen to good people? Is kind of a corollary of that. So the wisdom books in general, especially Ecclesiastes, offer a very skeptical or even a critical view of this balance of good and evil. As I mentioned, it almost serves as a counter voice or a questioning voice to the rest of some of the law. And it's not necessarily that it's contradictory to the rest of the Bible, but it sort of shows the depth and complexity of human life. That maybe at some point in our growth as humans, we are like kids, or we are in a certain phase where we have to be punished, and good and evil is a matter of goodness and sin, or bad and good actions. And then eventually, some have pointed out, we get to a phase where we grow, or maybe are a little bit more complex, and it's not just a simple formula like that. So I think that's what the wisdom books do, is they're a little bit just real and down to earth, that it's just not always that easy, and God isn't always just kind of like a Coke machine where you put in the quarter and you get the Coke, you put in the quarter, you get the Coke. But I feel like the wisdom books are more that it's a little bit of a slot machine sometimes. You put in a quarter, sometimes you do get quarters, sometimes you don't, sometimes you get a lot. And you can't just think about it as a simple formula. So they challenge biblical standard theology and kind of give another option and kind of problematize it in a good way, I think, because life is messy. And then last but not least, keep in mind Satan. This is really the most we see of this character. Now keep in mind that in the Bible, in the very first few chapters, Genesis chapter 3 in the garden, it does not say Satan is in the garden. It talks about the snake. Now later on, Christian tradition attributes this Satan as a character for the snake, but it's actually later on. So we get very little mention of Satan. We do a little bit in the New Testament. And this is the main place. This is a full-on character. So you can ask, who is this character? What is this character? Clearly no pitchforks and, horns or anything. That's much, much later tradition. So what's actually in the Bible? Very little. Elsewhere in the Bible, we find that he was perhaps a fallen star, which might have been a fallen angel. We don't really know. But he's a representation of something in the Bible, and at this stage, his name is the accuser. So ha is the definite article the, and Satan means accuser. So really, it's the word for prosecuting attorney in Hebrew civilization. So he was like a courtroom trial. He was the prosecutor. He was the accuser. So again, no pitchforks and no pointy tails at this point in time, but he's sort of that representation of either a voice or evil or something that accuses rather than God, who doesn't accuse. So he's a counter figure to God. Okay, last but not least, just a quick mention of the problem of evil, which we can't solve. I wish I could. I don't have any answers for you, but I want to just put in a handy chart, which as soon as you see a chart, you should be concerned. It's oversimplifying. And it is, so just take it with a huge grain of salt. But the classic philosophical problem of evil or bad in the universe is this theodicy, is the seeming contradiction between God, which would be if God is all good, God is all powerful, and God is all knowing, omniscient. How do you make sense of evil or bad in suffering in the world? So there are many different kinds of suffering. Philosophers have talked about that. But just know this is the core problem, and it has to do with monotheism again. So how do you explain the bad? Where does it come from? As someone has pointed out, you can either go in some directions to make sense of that and to reconcile that. One is on this side on the right, is you either change, maybe adapt your beliefs in God, about God. So some have said, well, maybe God isn't all good. Jung, answer to Job, who writes a book on that. God is not all powerful. That would be something that Rabbi Kushner writes, maybe when bad things happen to good people. God is not all knowing. Perhaps God just doesn't know about what's going to happen. And of course, there's the response of no God or no belief in God, atheism. Or some alternately have looked at adapting your views on evil. So maybe evil is just a result of human free will, and so it's really, at the end of the day, it's humans are responsible for this. It's human choice. Or at the other end, there's maybe no real evil. So that would be that at the end of the day, all of this just gets worked out. Or there's some sort of system of justice in the hereafter, or there's something called redemptive suffering, that at the end of the day, suffering or pain could be good. So those are just a few things to think about. Noise. So maybe in your postings, think about these categories. Wherever you are, whatever you believe, you all have some belief system of evil or bad or suffering. And how do you explain it? How do you understand it? So maybe you're a person of religious conviction, maybe you're not. But post about this if you feel comfortable and talk about maybe how you reconcile those two things.